Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman floweth all. Yet is it still the same. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace. Good morning. Today's topic is two mystics, East and West. In the oldest sacred text of India, the Rig Veda, we read, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. Truth is one, the wise call it by various names. What this tells us is that there is a supreme reality that lies at the heart of all existence. It has many names, yet none of them expresses it fully. No words can describe it. No mind can comprehend it, because it is greater than anything that speech or thought can contain. And yet throughout history, people have had the direct experience of this divine reality. We call them mystics. Today we're going to look at the lives and teachings of two mystics, and I've chosen these two because they are so dissimilar in so many different ways. They lived in different times, in different places, in different cultures, and in terms of the personal circumstances of their lives, they were as different as day is from night. So we will look at these two great visionaries and at their attempts to express this truth that is called by various names. Our two mystics are Abhinavagupta and William Blake. Abhinavagupta lived in Kashmir just over 1,000 years ago. William Blake lived about 800 years later. He was born in London in 1757, and he died there in 1827. Abhinavagupta was a scholar, a philosopher, a poet, a guru, a saint, and a seer, and he was widely revered while he was still alive. William Blake was an author, a poet, a painter, an artist, a printmaker, and a visionary thinker. And he was little appreciated during his lifetime. So let's begin with how their contemporaries perceived these two mystics. 1,000 years ago, a great event took place in Kashmir, and now I would like you all to transport yourselves back there mentally. Just listen to these images and imagine that you're there. 1,000 years ago, there was a great convocation of Kashmir's holy people, men and women alike, and they gathered for one purpose, to declare Abhinavagupta to be the greatest of all the spiritual teachers of Kashmir, of all the different sects of Shaivism. And this event was recorded in a poem called Reflections on the Master, written by Madhuraja Yogin. So here is the imagery of the poetry. Now just try to imagine you're there. You're seated in a pavilion, perfumed by flowers and incense, glistening with the light of oil lamps, resounding with the sound of music, and vibrant with the graceful movement of the dance. All attention is on a man of middle age and youthful appearance, dressed in silk as white as moonlight, and seated on a gilded cushion throne beneath a canopy shining with strands of pearls. His golden complexion glows, his eyes betoken spiritual bliss. His forehead bears 3 horizontal lines drawn in ash that mark him as a devotee of Shiva. His luxuriant hair is tied back with flower garlands, and his throat, not fully obscured by his long beard, is dark with a mixture of camphor, musk, sandal, and saffron, to suggest the appearance of Nilakanta, the blue-throated Shiva, who, at the mythological churning of the cosmic ocean, drank the resulting poison in order to protect humanity. Around the Guru's torso, the sacred thread hangs loosely, while the fingertips of his left hand pluck the strings of the lute-like veena, producing wonderful sounds. His right hand, wrapped with a strand of Rudraksha beads, rests on his thigh, the position of his fingers indicating that he is a knower of the ultimate reality. Seated at his feet, his male and female disciples, the siddhas and yoginis, form an adoring circle, listening attentively and writing down all that he says. So that's how Abhinavagupta was perceived by his contemporaries. Blake received no such recognition. He hoped that his work would be appreciated during his lifetime, but he feared that it would not. In fact, the response from the public was generally indifferent and sometimes hostile. As for the existing religious establishment, they considered Blake's understanding of Christianity to be blasphemous, and he's only lucky that they did not condemn him officially, so that he was able to express his critical opinions throughout his lifetime. Blake placed the highest value on the virtues of mercy, pity, peace, and love. He condemned what he called the loveless morality of the churches, and he opposed the oppressive ecclesiastical authority. What he called the preachers of morality failed to understand, in his view, that God is present in all things. In fact, Blake felt that organized religion was designed to keep people in the dark, to keep them perceiving that spiritual presence in the physical world. Instead of looking to find God on the altar of church, Blake told people they would be better to look within their own hearts. However, no amount of neglect or dismissal would dampen Blake's fervent desire to express himself in his vision. He felt a personal responsibility to God and to society to express his visionary message through the words of his poetry and the images of his innovative and unconventional art. Blake was a scholar of the Bible, but he rejected the narrowness of Christian doctrine. In fact, here's how he put it, addressing the church. "Thy heaven doors are my hell gates." Pretty strong language. And compare this. This again is about his experience. "The cistern contains, the fountain overflows." Blake felt that he needed no savior but his own right thinking and his own proper action, born of his own imagination. Now, here we come to an interesting feature. Blake used a lot of words with very specific and different meanings, and imagination is one of them. For Blake, imagination meant the power of consciousness that animates the human body-mind complex. It is present in everyone, and it creates the world of each person's experience. That for him was imagination, that divine indwelling consciousness. And he put it in these words, "Every man's wisdom is peculiar to his individuality. Every eye sees differently. As the eye, such the object. Everything possible to be believed is an image of truth." Therefore, Blake was at odds with the religious, political, and social establishments of his time. However, he would be in full agreement with the philosophy of Abhinavagupta. That philosophy stated that everything we experience is a manifestation of an all-pervading divine consciousness. Now, we've seen how Abhinavagupta and Blake were regarded by their contemporaries. Now we're going to look at a brief outline of the lives of each of these men. Abhinavagupta was born around the year 950 or 960 to a prestigious family. There were several generations of highly respected scholars and devotees that he could claim as his direct ancestors, going back at least 200 years. At the time, the prevailing spirit in Kashmir was one of great religious devotion, and so it is not surprising that Abhinavagupta's parents were devotees of the Lord Shiva and devoted to his worship. As a young child, Abhinavagupta showed many hints of the greatness that was to come. He had boundless curiosity, And so he was taught at first by his father, who was a great scholar, and his father's brother, another scholar. They taught him the fundamentals of Sanskrit grammar, logic, literature, and poetry. Outside the family, when he began having other teachers, they were all impressed by his love of learning and his intellectual brilliance, and, above all, his command of language. In fact, they compared him to the grammarian Patanjali, not to be confused with the Patanjali who wrote the Yoga Sutra. When Abhinavagupta was still a child, his mother died, and his father from that time on embraced a life of renunciation. Abhinavagupta accordingly immersed himself in the agamas, or the tantras, the sacred Shaiva scriptures, and he spent most of his time with his spiritual teachers. He vowed not to marry, possibly emulating his father, and then as he became a young man, he went on to seek the finest teachers, and he mastered the subjects of literature, drama, aesthetics, that's the study of beauty, a wide spectrum of dualistic and non-dualistic Shaiva philosophies, as well as the philosophies of Buddhism and Jainism. He maintained close ties to his family all his life, and by early age a circle of disciples grew up around him. These were his siblings, his cousins, and his in-laws, and it was for them that he composed his massive encyclopedic work Tantraloka, Light on the Tantra. At the beginning of the work, he explains that this book rests on logic, on the authority of the revealed scriptures, but also on his own spiritual realization. In maturity, Abhinavagupta's contribution to the intellectual and spiritual life of India was of incalculable dimension, and it would not diminish with the passage of time. He was remembered not only for his intellectual brilliance, but also for his own experience of the higher states of consciousness, which allowed him to have a transfigured view by which he could inspire others. Abhinavagupta's departure from this life comes from an oral legend. It has more this comes from oral tradition, and it has more the character of a pious legend than of any kind of historical fact. As the story goes, around the year 1015 or later, he felt that his earthly mission had come to an end, and so he departed one day with 1,200 disciples in tow, setting out for the bite of a cave 20 miles outside of Srinagar. The cave entrance is located on a mountainside, and immediately you descend into this dark labyrinth with places here and there for meditation. Farther into the cave, there's a small opening, and on that day, Abhinavagupta disappeared into that opening, never to be seen again. His disciples remembered him as an illumined soul, marked by gentleness, generosity of spirit, open-mindedness, and moral integrity. Later generations came to regard him as one of India's foremost intellectual giants. He left a literary legacy of astonishing beauty, and a spiritual legacy of profound insight. Now, briefly, William Blake's life. It bore little resemblance to Abhinavagupta's. But first, let's remember that this experience of the divine is open to all people of all times, places, and cultures, and it can be articulated in vastly differing ways. Abhinavagupta and William Blake both experienced a society and culture that were very, very different from each other. Kashmir in the 10th and the 11th centuries was an idyllic valley. It was a great center of Hindu, Buddhist, and secular thinking, and religion played an important role in people's lives, and generally life there was harmonious. England, 800 years later, it was in the middle of radical change because of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution had uprooted people and their children from the countryside and exploited them in the degrading urban wasteland of factories and slums. The Christian religion also was undergoing change, and that change was often contentious. One faction clung resolutely to the past, while another faction tried to reshape its tenets in according to the rationalist principles that were spurred on by that same enlightenment that secularized European thought in general. So that was the backdrop to William Blake's life. Change, conflict. Blake was born to a working-class family of moderate means in an unpretentious neighborhood of London. Now, unlike Abhinavagupta, who was taught from the time he was very, very little by the finest teachers, Blake avoided education altogether. Instead, he would wander about the streets of London, experiencing the grime and the crowding, and then he would go out into the countryside and enjoy its unspoiled beauty. And he claimed in the unspoiled beauty of the countryside to have celestial visions. This contrast must have impressed itself tremendously on this young child's awareness, because in later life he would develop a theory of what he called the contraries, meaning the perplexities that arise in our world of duality. And we'll speak more about that later. Blake showed artistic ability from early childhood, and he was encouraged by his parents, who for a brief while, when he was 10 years old, enrolled him in an art school. However, they couldn't sustain the cost for long. At the age of 14, Blake became apprenticed to a master engraver, and at the age of 21, he went off on his own. For a while, studying at the newly formed Academy of the Arts, the Royal Academy, while he was trying to support himself as an engraver. He was naturally curious and enthusiastic from the earliest days, just like Abhinavagupta. But unlike Abhinavagupta, who had teachers and teachers beyond belief, Blake was largely self-taught. He educated himself by reading the classical traditions of Greece and Rome. He was well-versed in the Bible, as well as in the Norse Eddas. He studied the scientific and philosophical teachings of the mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, and also the teachings, the non-dualistic thought of the great Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus. And this is only the beginning of his studies. Unlike Abhinavagupta, who remained celibate, Blake married, and he had a loving wife, Catherine Boucher. She was his devoted partner in all of his artistic endeavors. However, Blake's literary and graphic work was mostly self-published and had never brought in more than a pittance, so they lived in poverty. And throughout Blake's life, he remained largely unrecognized, except by a small circle of friends and admirers. The English literary critic Catherine Spurgeon wrote in her book Mysticism in English Literature, written in 1913, that, quote, Blake was radiantly happy and serene, rich in the midst of poverty. Spurgeon named him the greatest mystic to write in the English language, and here's how she observed it. He lived in a world of glory, of spirit, and of vision, which for him was the only real world. At the age of 4, he saw God looking in at the window, and from that time until he welcomed the approach of death by singing songs of joy which made the rafters ring, he lived in an atmosphere of divine illumination. Now, we've seen how Abhinavagupta and Blake were regarded by their contemporaries. We've seen a brief outline of the lives of each of these men. Now we're going to look at how each of these great mystics gave voice to his extraordinary vision. Both were great writers. But again, as different as their lives were, so was the way they expressed themselves. Abhinavagupta had been acclaimed since childhood as a master of Sanskrit, which is an immensely complex language, and in maturity he brought the full range of its resources to bear in expressing a distinctive, dazzling verbalization of his spiritual insights. Blake's language was deceptively simple. Sometimes it had the naivety of a nursery rhyme. Even so, it revealed a vision of reality transfigured by this direct experience of the divine reality. So in connection with his writing, Blake found the fullest means to expression was what he called the illuminated book. He reinvented the medieval illuminated manuscript. Abhinavagupta's and Blake's means were both different, but both of their ways of expression were radiant with the power of beauty. In fact, Abhinavagupta was renowned as an aesthetician, a person who studies beauty, the aesthetics, the philosophy of beauty. And what Abhinavagupta discovered is that there's a profound connection between beauty and spirituality. He said there was an essential flavor, a rasa, that pervaded every experience of beauty, whether it was literary, artistic, dramatic, or musical. And that sense of joy provides for us a glimpse of the immense bliss at the heart of reality. Abhinava found that the inspiration of beauty offers a fleeting glimpse also of one's own higher self. And so the reality of our mundane existence can be infused with the truth of divinity through this experience of beauty. Blake also recognized the link between the artistic and the spiritual. He expressed it through his illuminated book, which provided an interaction of text and image that allows for multiple possibilities of interpretation. Often a verse would say one thing, but the accompanying image would tell a different story. And this really gets the mind to working. And together, one can deduce nuanced and deeply insightful messages from Blake's work. Now, Blake's own aesthetic theories were that art originates in an internal, private vision, and any external, public expression of it cannot convey the original spontaneity. So because of that, Blake desisted from creating definitive or mass-produced editions of his works. Instead, they were all small editions, handmade, and changed over time to preserve this original freshness as much as he could. In his epic poem, Jerusalem, written between 1804 and 1820, Blake celebrated the power of his inspiration with these words: "I rest not from my great task to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man inwards into the worlds of thought, into eternity, ever expanding in the bosom of God, the human imagination." Again, imagination, the indwelling power of consciousness present in every human being. Also, the innate capacity to pierce through the mundane. Imagination is the indwelling divinity of every human soul. And for Blake, it formed an essential counterweight to the mere intellectual, to the scientific rationalism of the Enlightenment, which he felt led to a dimming of emotional and spiritual life. Blake contrasted imagination with experience, by which he meant life in the purely materialistic sphere, deprived of mystery and deprived of that divine dimension called God. Both Abhinavagupta and Blake experienced that ultimate oneness directly. Now we're going to look at how Abhinavagupta's non-dualistic tantric philosophy explains this reality of the one and the world of the many. In this philosophical system, the supreme reality is called Shiva or Atman, meaning the supreme self. It is self-luminous consciousness called Prakasha, literally a shining forth. But it is also its own self-awareness and a power of self-expression called Vimarsha or Shakti. So consciousness and its creative power are an inseparable oneness, and they together form the supreme reality. It is paradoxically eternally unchanging and dynamic at the same time. According to the tantric teachings, Maya is Shiva's own power to obscure and to limit. And so by Maya, Shiva projects the world, enters into it, and experiences it through every one of us as his divine play. And the goal for us, finite human beings, in this game of cosmic hide and seek, is to realize our own identity with that infinite one that is our true being. Abhinavagupta summarized this teaching in his probably earliest known poetic work, called 15 Verses on Enlightenment, Bodha Panchadashika. There he wrote that the basic teachings of non-dualistic Shaivism can be expressed in this poetry of great beauty, power, and depth. The poem celebrates Shiva and Shakti, consciousness and its power. The Lord Shiva shines as the never-setting sun, and the goddess Shakti ever reflects his glory. They are in truth a singular and self-effulgent consciousness, which, in Abhinavagupta's words, affects the multitude wonder of worlds at once coming forth and dissolving. So every moment in the life of the universe is miraculous and divine. Yet the unawakened soul fails to know this, and in stupefaction mistakes his limitation on the light of awareness for a misperceived freedom, which is in fact a terrifying and transitory wandering. Is there a way out? Most certainly there is. Whether through a guru's guidance or through divine grace, one comes to merge with Shiva and gains liberation, the highest experience of reality. With full clarity, the enlightened soul then recognizes, and again, Abhinavagupta's words, these two, bondage and liberation, are Shiva's own essence. They are not separate. In reality, there is no division in the Supreme Lord. Blake had that same experience of oneness, and he expressed it in his poetry, his prose, and his art. He was well versed in divergent philosophical, religious, and intellectual and literary traditions, and he drew on all of them, but he never formed a consistent philosophy of his own. And instead, he would use imagery of sort of an eclectic and obscure mythology of his own devising to get his ideas across. And sometimes that can be very confusing. Abhinavagupta and Blake both were self-defined non-dualists, but yet they recognized the dualistic nature of the world in which we live, and they did not deny its reality. Abhinavagupta accepted that the manifest and the transcendental are two aspects of a single, all-inclusive reality. This was reflected very much in the teaching of Ramakrishna when he said the absolute and the relative are two facets of the one greater reality. So as consciousness in itself, devoid of any content, nirvikalpa, that reality is called Paramartha Satya, the supreme reality. And as consciousness conditioned by awareness of the manifest, it is called Samvriti Satya, the conventional or empirical reality, where the highest truth remains hidden. And together the two constitute an indivisible wholeness, the supreme non-duality that Abhinavagupta called Paradvaita, supreme non-duality. Back to the English writer Carolyn Spurgeon. Here's what she wrote about Blake's view. According to Blake, the universe as we know it is the result of the fall of the one life from unity into division. This fall has come about through man seeking separation and taking the part for the whole. Nature, therefore, or the present form of mental existence, is the result of a contraction of consciousness or selfhood, a tendency for everything to shrink and contract about its own center. Now this immediately jumped out at me because the word contraction is used frequently in Abhinavagupta's philosophy, Samkocha in Sanskrit. And for Shaiva non-dualism, contraction is this process whereby the infinite one expresses itself as the finite many. And in this case, each of the individual ego selves that results sees itself at the very center of existence. And as Blake said, a tendency for everything to shrink and contract about its own center. Very, very much the same view. Blake thought that in this world, in our daily lives, the soul was subject to two states, which he called innocence and experience. Innocence means a spontaneous, natural, even childlike freedom and wonder, all reflecting the divine origin. Experience is a condition excessively reliant on reason, and experience stifles innocence, and what results is a world of clashing contraries imposed by society, church, and political authorities. Blake's contraries are much more than a simple matter of black and white do's and don'ts. Let's think about this for a minute. It's good to tell the truth, right? Well, what if telling the truth causes pain or harm to someone else? Is truth still good? And what about a white lie? Does that sometimes not yield beneficial results? Blake's idea of these contraries demonstrates that there are no absolutes in this relative world. But followers of doctrine will deny this to their last breath. Pragmatically, Blake taught that without this challenge of the contraries to dispel dogmatism, there could be no progression. What we deem to be good and evil is the underlying theme of Blake's collections, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. And two of his most famous poems come from these collections, Little Lamb and the Tiger. You've probably heard of them. Together, Little Lamb and the Tiger illustrate a monistic or non-dualistic view that both come from good. And, illustrate this monistic view. Good and evil alike both come from the same divine source. The same God that made the lamb made the tiger. Otherwise, we would have to accept the duality of two ultimate forces, a God and a devil. And that, of course, is an untenable proposition for any non-dualist. So Abhinavagupta and Blake agreed on this. What we experience as good and evil both emerge from the same divine energy, merely expressed in opposing ways. All manifestation requires this polarity, and when that polarity dissolves, then only the transcendental one remains. 800 years before Blake, Abhinavagupta expressed this idea of the contraries, although he did not call them that, in his poem 12 Verses on the Highest Truth, Paramartha Dwadashika. Here's verse number 8, and just listen for all the imagery, how vivid it is. Confusion thick with argument and counter-argument over the woes of existence is made denser still by the bondage of mental wavering, ceaselessly expressed through impulses and cogitations that grow like darkening clouds in the sky. If this confusion did not appear in the sky of consciousness, wherein the alternation of the one and the many is natural and inherent, where else would it appear? Moreover, what supreme perfection could be known by a plurality of souls? What he's telling us is that everything takes place within this single and singular reality of consciousness. And 2 verses later, Abhinavagupta seems to speak with the voice of God when he says, whatever things are manifest are met in me, the true supreme sky of consciousness. For the splendors in them shine brightly and undividedly in me, the eternal splendor. I am that boundless radiance of consciousness, truly and infinitely free, and ever guiding my own creative acts. Free of deception, I dispel the darkness fashioned from the opposing pair of oneness and duality. Now for Abhinavagupta, this sort of philosophical speculation and practical guidance go hand in hand. Ultimately, the world of our experience cannot be separate from the divine source. And so in the opening verse of the same poem, here's what he writes. Practically speaking, at all times spread peace, and check the stream of chatter with those who speak of trifling things. Fall not into the habit of asking, what or why is that, and who are you? That which shines uninterruptedly with glittering splendor, making distinct the phenomenal and imagined things of the world, is itself free of all distinctions. What perception of objects can there be in the void, the domain of Shiva, the abiding reality, the supreme Brahman? The poem goes on to question whether the world exists on its own or only in our experience of it. Shaiva non-dualism claims that the world of our experience is largely a world of our own making. It consists of sensations received by the mind, then internally formed into perceptions, concepts, attitudes, reactions, and meaning. So we are not experiencing anything in the external world directly. Rather, we are experiencing the idea of it in the mind. However, we must also remember that this external reality and the mind that perceives it are both themselves but ideas in the mind of God, that ultimate consciousness. Now, Blake also followed a system of philosophical idealism. That's what this is called, philosophical idealism. The world exists in my awareness of it. And in a poem called London, from Songs of Experience, here are 2 verses. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. Now this language is a little antiquated at this point, so let's look into what this means. The poem represents the individual soul wandering through the city, and the city is a metaphor for human existence. The word chartered, it's paradoxical. Here it means both the rights granted to the rich and powerful through legal authority, and it also means the oppression of the poor, which is the other side of the coin. Wandering through this bleak, polluted city streets is like the existential wandering that Abhinavagupta would know as samsara, the transmigration from one lifetime to the next. The word samsara literally means wandering. Mark, that's an interesting word. It can simply mean to notice. But various connotations apply as well. In marking the people, the objects, and the institutions, the individual also defines them, limits them, interprets them, and relates to them. Maybe the perceptions and interpretations are off the mark, so to speak. So these experiences are of an imperfect world, born of our own misunderstanding. In truth, we owe this human existence, with all its limitation, pain, and bondage, to our mind-forged manacles, our mental handcuffs. If mind-forged, our thoughts are perpetuated. Our thoughts and let's see. Here we are. If our condition is mind-forged, and all of our thoughts and feelings perpetuate our bondage, then we need an active imagination to transform both the individual and society. And Blake thought that there was no doubt that the spiritual commingles with the mundane. So there is that potential in this world to go beyond it. Abhinavagupta agrees with this. His poetry continually urges us to see God everywhere and to relate ordinary acts of perception and thought to the divine. He also urges us to proceed from a worshipful relationship with God, which is a dualistic concept, to the liberating knowledge of full identity with the Supreme God, which is the non-dualism. We must purify all of our individual consciousness of the last vestiges of Maya's limitation and obscuration, and when we do that, our consciousness expands to infinity. Blake also wrote of expanded consciousness in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which was composed between 1790 and 1793. And I think these words will probably ring a bell with most of you. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. Narrow chinks of his cavern. This is a reference to Plato's allegory of the cave, which demonstrates how most of humanity lives without the awareness of a higher reality. We are all as if imprisoned in a cave, facing inward and observing the shadows cast on the rear wall by a fire burning behind us. We see only the shadows and not what accounts for them. In other words, we are deceived by our own perceptions of the phenomenal world. We mistake appearance for reality. If we can break the chains that bind us, we can turn and exit the cave, stepping out into the higher reality illumined by the light of the sun. It was this radiance of divine unity into which Blake himself had stepped. Even for the unenlightened soul in the cave, we have to remember that the cave is not entirely devoid of light. Consciousness is ever present. The fire, however deceptive it may be, is not without that glimmer of consciousness. Because, as I said, without consciousness, no perception of any sort would be possible. So no matter how benighted we may be, there's always that faint intuition within of a higher reality within us. Abhinavagupta expressed this in his 15 verses on enlightenment. But, as it is said, the mark of the unenlightened soul is its measure of limitation on the light of awareness. Distinct from such dullness is the knowledge that knows no measure. He pursued that same idea in the first 2 verses of another poem, a reflection on the highest truth. The highest truth shines not divided as the lights of sun, moon, lamp, and the like, but is an all-exceeding pervasiveness. The dual aspects of illumination and illuminated account for the ordinary experience of the world, but are only the outward appearance of the light of truth. An object perceived by anyone, knowing rightly, is therefore not a separate thing. For in consciousness there is no distinction based on this and that. In no way should consciousness, self-shining in the splendor of purest unity, be broken apart into difference. So the experience of the Supreme Consciousness is self-knowledge. Blake proposed that the proof of man's divinity lies in his desire for God. For how can one desire what he cannot recognize? In a small book called There Is No Natural Religion, Blake wrote, "Man's perceptions are not bounded by organs of perception. He perceives more than sense, though ever so acute, can discover." And on the final page of the book he writes, "Therefore, God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is." Abhinavagupta would have looked at this as an expression of the Lord's divine play. But what is it about? Shiva, through self-projected diversity, diverts himself as every jiva, as every individual soul. And the aim is to find the way back to original perfection. Abhinavagupta found this ultimate identity in his highest state of illumination. And there we find erased the last distinction between the finite, temporal becoming and infinite, eternal being. He expressed his own experience in the first 4 verses of his 20 verses on the great teaching, Mahopadesha Vimshatika. And this is addressing his beloved Lord Shiva. "Salutation to you who take form as the universe of mind and matter, even while your nature transcends its diversity. To you, the true self, who are radiance and everlasting joy and infinite power. One here said that you are you, and I am I, that you alone are, and I am not, or that I am you. Salutations repeatedly to the Supreme Self, wherein there are not two, the I and you. Constantly have I sought you and self inside of me. There I see not you and self, but what I see is only you. Now contemplating you, whose essence is the self, I, your devotee, whose outward appearance is but you made manifest, offer repeated salutations to the unity of you and me." 16 verses later, the poem comes to an end with these words of advice. "This alone is the highest worship. In all circumstances and at all times, fix your mind on the effulgent Lord of the universe in the full awareness of his oneness and of your oneness with him." In one of his most heartfelt poems, Abhinavagupta addresses Shiva as Bhairava, the highest reality. The poem is called Hymn to Bhairava, Bhairava Stava. And in it we find expressed a full range of human existence with alternating joys and sorrows, the terror of impending death, and finally the supreme joy of liberation while living, Jivan Mukti. I'm going to read 6 of the 9 verses. "Beginningless, endless, made of consciousness alone, the one, whose diversity is the outspread existence of everything moving and unmoving. Lord Bhairava, protector of the helpless, I praise you in my heart with an awareness made of you. Through the power of your grace, this whole world now shines for me, is made of your own substance, and you, great Lord, are forever and ever my own self. Thus for me, all of creation is but my own self alone. For this reason, in the self, in you, the all-pervading Lord, there is no talk of existential dread. Even though present in living creatures and in the multitudes of activities that occasion anxiety, confusion, and hard-borne suffering. In the luminosity of my awakening to truth, I now behold the real nature of all things as proclaimed by the wise. I reach full satisfaction in the self, in you who are full beyond measure in ultimate deathlessness, even in this changeful life. Whenever a distressing circumstance, meting out no small affliction, should enter the meadow of my mind, then indeed, O Lord, there showers forth the best of remedies, the celebration of my non-difference from you. O Lord Bhairava, this awareness of mine sings and dances and rejoices greatly, merged in you, the beloved, the unity difficult for others to grasp through ordinary understanding, but easy now for me to behold. 800 years later, 3,800 miles away, Blake found the same unity at the heart of all things, expressing itself in endless diversity. He acknowledged this transcendental oneness in the unforgettable opening lines of a poem, a very late poem called Auguries of Innocence. And these are the words with which we'll conclude. To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. In a very different way from how Blake spoke of eternity in an hour, I hope that for all of you this past hour has not seemed like an eternity. I'll conclude with a chant. Om Ardhvam Duality Jyotir Ahamasmi Jyotir Duality Brahmahamasmi Yohamasmi Brahmahamasmi Ahamasmi Brahmahamasmi Ahamevahamam Juhomi Swaha. The light within me shines, I am the light. The light that shines brightly, I am that Brahman. That which I am is nothing but Brahman. I am, and I am Brahman. I myself offer myself into the infinite light, which is myself. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace.